It is one of the oldest mysteries of mankind. But now, researchers have finally succeeded in shedding much more light on the mysterious Stonehenge darkness. Because a newly discovered mass grave near the mythical stone circle actually harbors a completely new suspicion about its true purpose. But that's not all. In the same breath, detailed analyses have revealed the origin of the so-called altar stone and shown that it comes from a completely different part of the world than the other megaliths. We have conquered diseases that once meant certain death. We have decoded the genome, and we are sending space probes to other planets. Yet, despite all this, we are not able to explain an ancient stone circle. Okay, admittedly, this casual formulation probably doesn't do justice to the profound mystery surrounding Stonehenge, and yet it gets pretty close to the heart of the matter. Located near Amesbury in the English county of Wiltshire, Stonehenge is none other than one of the most mysterious testimonies of the world. How did people manage to move so many heavy stone blocks from A to B an estimated 5,000 years ago, and then erect them and pile some of them on top of each other? The question of the site's original purpose seems no less confusing, even though the pendulum of experts has long since swung in a certain direction. After all, as early as the beginning of the 20th century, British astronomer Joseph Norman Lockyer had already determined that the so-called heel stone of the formation is aligned with the sunrise at the summer solstice. The theory that Stonehenge represents a kind of Stone Age calendar is therefore considered extremely likely by researchers. And yet, we do not know how exactly and according to which system the stone block-supported time measurement took place. In order to finally change this, British archaeologist Timothy Darvill from Bournemouth University compared the latest findings and discoveries in the area around Stonehenge with other ancient calendar systems a few years ago, and in doing so, brought some astonishing circumstances to light. First and foremost, the fact that Stonehenge was probably much more precise as a solar calendar than previously thought. And the research results suggest that the complex was based on a tropical solar year of 365.25 days. In this context, the 30 sarsen, the sandstone blocks weighing several tons that we used to build Stonehenge, stood in a circular formation, each representing one day within a month. This month was in turn divided into 3 weeks of 10 days each, with particularly prominent stones marking the beginning of a new week. After 12 rotations, a year would be complete. But since 12 times 30 only adds up to 360 and not 365.25 days, the 5 triliths, the famous gate structures made of 2 supporting stones and a capstone, were erected, which served as additional intercalary days on the one hand and as a dedication to the gods on the other. At the same time, the 10-day week of the Stonehenge calendar could also provide us with further information about its mysterious background. Such systems were actually used by other cultures at the time, such as in the Eastern Mediterranean or in ancient Egypt. In this context, the knowledge on which the system was based must have traveled a long way. But more remarkably, the experts have now discovered that another part of the monument has also traveled an astonishing distance. How did this extremely heavy stone get from Scotland to southern England? It has been known for some time that the material used in Stonehenge did not come from just one quarry around the corner. While the large sarsens were still of local origin, the approximately 80 bluestones were brought from Wales, 250 kilometers away. Why and, above all, how this was done has not been conclusively explained. Just like the question of how the builders of Stonehenge transported a 6-ton sandstone over a distance of more than 750 kilometers to make it the centerpiece of their structure. While the 5-meter-long and approximately 1-meter-wide altar stone lies toppled over in the center of the site, researchers suspect that it was erected at the same time as the triliths during the second construction phase between 4,620 and 4,480 years ago. Whether the altar stone really once stood upright cannot be said with absolute certainty, but what is beyond question is the fact that, from a purely geological point of view, it enjoys an exceptional position among the megaliths of Stonehenge. Adorned with greenish speckles, this block has a very different composition from the others, But despite all this, experts long held to the idea that the altar stone also has its roots in Wales. But as we now know, this is simply not the case. After the team, led by Anthony Clark of Curtin University in Australia, subjected the stone to a detailed mineralogical and isotopic analysis, it was clear that it did not come from the previously suspected area. At the center of the investigation were tiny grains of the minerals zircon, rutile, and apatite, whose isotopic composition and age can provide crucial clues about the origin and age of the sandstone. And the bottom line is that the analyses showed that some of the mineral grains in the stone are between 1 and 2 billion years old and are definitely not of local origin. Combined with the mineral composition, this great age suggests that the oldest parts of the sandstone were formed in the Precambrian, which means that we are talking about a time when dinosaurs didn't even exist yet. Furthermore, the sandstone did not just form just anywhere, but on the territory of the supercontinent Laurasia, the remains of which form Scotland today. And with this knowledge in mind, it is probably not surprising that the composition of the stone fits neither the geology around Stonehenge nor the rock formations in Wales, but it fits a region in northeastern Scotland all the better. No wonder, since this area is the only one in the whole of Great Britain that contains this particular combination of minerals. But how on earth did people manage to bring the altar stone to southern England so many thousands of years ago? Again, we are dealing here with a 6-ton block that has traveled more than 750 kilometers. Incidentally, this also makes the altar stone a record holder. We know of no other stone in a monument of this era that was transported such a great distance. Exactly how the stone was brought to its intended location, however, is a historical mystery, and transporting it overland was, to put it mildly, a challenging undertaking. Even if the people had used pack animals, they would have to overcome many obstacles in the landscape, such as rivers, swamps, mountains, and dense forests. More than a few experts consider such an undertaking with the means of the time to be practically impossible, and they consider it more likely that the altar stone came to England by sea route instead. In detail, it was first shipped by sea along the east coast of Great Britain, and then via the Thames and other rivers to the vicinity of Stonehenge. After all, we should not forget that, according to recent studies, the megalithic culture of the Stonehenge builders probably goes back to Stone Age seafarers who spread along the eastern seacoast. And so it happens that a simple stone not only reveals new background information about an ancient structure, but also provides valuable insights into the wide-ranging connections of the culture of its creators. The origin of the altar stone suggests that extensive long-distance trade networks were already established at that time, and that society was probably much more complexly organized than previously thought for this Stone Age chapter of Britain. This mass grave sheds new light on Stonehenge. From an archaeological point of view, the unexpected often happens. What began as routine construction work in the city of Salisbury ultimately brought to light an enormous burial site consisting of several circular burial mounds, which was probably built between 2400 and 1500 BC. In other words, we are talking about the same era in which the central parts of Stonehenge were built, and only about 15 kilometers away. According to the experts, the fact that we overlooked the ancient graves for so long is because they were originally filled up with soil and later leveled by agriculture. Inside the barrows, the experts identified the remains of 10 deceased and traces of ash from 3 cremations. Well, at least up to now. Since the researchers have so far only been able to examine 5 of the 20 graves, the number of mortal remains is likely to increase even further in the future. All in all, this find once again testifies to the important cultural and spiritual significance that Stonehenge had thousands of years ago. After all, the world-famous stone circle is likely to have just been the centerpiece of a full-blown ritual landscape. Several astronomically aligned ditches and ramparts have already been discovered near the monument, and the nearby prehistoric settlement of Durgan Wells was also equipped with a colossal stone row, a superhenge of ritual pits, and a 2-kilometer-long wood henge. And if we go back to the barrows at this point, one of them is particularly unusual. In the center of this barrow is the grave of a child who was buried with a vessel of the so-called Yorkshire type. And as the name suggests, this type of ceramic was actually more common in northern England. So this artifact may also testify to the great distances traveled by the people of the time. And for some experts, the discovery of the burial mound suggests that Stonehenge itself was once used as a burial place. Stonehenge has been the subject of fascination and mysteries for centuries. How were people with only primitive tools able to carve, transport, and erect the stones? In addition to the enormous stones used, the monument stone construction shows a precise alignment with the movements of the sun. Today, the exact work would require GPS, surveyors, and a whole staff of structural engineers. And primitive followers of a sun cult are supposed to have accomplished all this? The theories that Stonehenge served as a kind of prehistoric calendar indicating the solstices and equinoxes have long since ceased to satisfy anyone. Even among researchers, there were reasonable doubts that this site was simply a calendar or a sacred place. Stones weighing up to 25 tons. Stonehenge is generally dated to be around 5,000 years old. Bear in mind that people at that time only used stone tools such as hand axes and scrapers or simple arrowheads for hunting. They also had simple tools made of bone and wood. People at this time had not yet developed any metalworking skills. There were no hammers and chisels. However, this prehistoric monument, located on Salisbury Plain in Wiltshire, England, is undoubtedly a testament to technical skills that go far beyond bone, wood, or stone scrapers. Stonehenge consists of a series of concentric circles of standing stones arranged in an incredibly precise and architecturally planned manner. The outer circle of Stonehenge has a diameter of about 30 meters and consists of large sarsen stones that are up to 4 meters high and about 2.1 meters wide and weigh up to 25 tons. These stones are connected by horizontal lintel stones that have been carefully placed on top of the upright sarsen stones. Within this outer circle is another ring of smaller blue stones, believed to be from the Preseli Hills in Wales, and these mountains are an incredible 240 kilometers away. The blue stones are significantly smaller than the sarsen stones, but their origin from such a great distance still remains a mystery. How could people have managed to transport stones over 240 kilometers 5,000 years ago? Conventional theories would have us believe that people did this with tree trunks and ropes. But 240 kilometers is roughly equivalent to the distance between Hamburg and Hanover, or Munich and Stuttgart. Can people really move these stones over 240 kilometers without paths or roads and through forests, valleys, swamps, and meadows simply on rolling tree trunks? At the center of Stonehenge are the triliths, pairs of large sarsen stones each connected to a third stone, a lintel. This structure forms an almost perfect horseshoe shape when viewed from above and is aligned with the sunrise at the summer solstice. Interestingly, there is evidence of a second ring of wooden posts which has now disappeared but was once part of the Stonehenge complex. This wooden ring may have been there before the stones were erected. The entire complex is surrounded by a circular earth wall with a diameter of around 100 meters. This rampart, together with a surrounding ditch, forms the outermost boundary of the monument. Radiocarbon dating suggests that Stonehenge was built in several phases over a period of around 1,500 years. That's a lot of time, yet we may doubt the generations of Stone Age people were busy laboriously grinding stones over great distances. Back then, people's lives were still dominated by hunting. They had to spend almost the entire day getting food. A large construction site with centuries of work simply does not fit into the picture. The axis of the monument is aligned so that it corresponds to sunrise on the day of the summer solstice and sunset on the day of the winter solstice. But even the assumption that Stonehenge could have been a great calendar does not fit the culture of the people who lived 5,000 years ago. These events were not yet of such great importance to hunter-gatherers. Experts assume that the significance of calendar dates only became important for sedentary farmers and cattle breeders. Groundbreaking discovery. Everything is completely different. Are you wondering exactly what this recent discovery at Stonehenge is and what it tells us about this enigmatic monument? This find concerns the so-called altar stone, It stands out clearly from the other stones due to its size and different type of stone, and it naturally occupies a special position. Recent investigations have revealed that the altar stone comes from a previously unknown source in the north of Great Britain, and this finding is in stark contrast to the previous assumption that all stones in the inner circle, including the altar stone, come from the Preseli region in West Wales. The discovery was made by Richard Bevans, a professor of geology and earth sciences at Aberystwyth University, and disproves the theory of Herbert Henry Thomas, who first examined the stones and claimed that all the stones in the inner circle of Stonehenge were certainly from West Wales. The altar stone contains an unusually high amount of the chemical element barium, and this helped the researchers in their search. Stones from over 50 different locations from South Wales to the west of England were compared, but for a long time no reliable source for the altar stone could be found. Only in the far north of England were stones discovered that resembled the altar stone at Stonehenge. This naturally raises the question of how people could have transported this one huge stone further than all the others, and above all, how did people who had barely moved out of their environment know that this exact type of stone existed there? All these rational explanations that scientists like to use to dismiss the supernatural sound too contrived, too improbable, and too unrealistic. There must be another explanation. The new discovery that the large altar stone comes from the north of England supports theories that our ancestors were either not quite as primitive as we thought, or that there were creatures at work here that may have had nothing to do with Stone Age people. The paranormal is happening here. Have you ever heard that in the 1970s, a whole group of people camping in the monument simply disappeared after a thunderstorm? The story was almost forgotten, but today it is back in the news and there are even eyewitnesses who remember the incident clearly. In the 1970s, Stonehenge was still freely accessible, and it was the time of the hippies and the flower power peace movement, whose followers were also interested in mysticism of all kinds. The young people had been to the nearby village the day before their disappearance to stock up on food. There they reported that they were going to celebrate a ritual at Stonehenge with tents and sleeping bags. Late in the evening, a violent thunderstorm set in with lightning, and some of the villagers were still thinking about the young people at Stonehenge. When they went to see how the campers had fared at Stonehenge the next day, the hippies had disappeared. Their tents and sleeping bags, rucksacks, and some clothes were still there. Even the fireplace was still visible. But there was no trace of the young people. Since the event, the idea that Stonehenge could possibly be a portal to other worlds or dimensions has naturally increased. Many locals around Stonehenge are convinced that the site actually has a magical background. In addition to the purely physical and astronomical meanings, Stonehenge could therefore also have a metaphysical aspect that has not yet been fully discovered. However, researchers have already discovered that sound is conducted in a special way within the stone circles, and that the stones begin to vibrate when certain events occur. In para-research, it is often assumed that the builders of prehistoric monuments, such as Stonehenge or the pyramids, use sound and vibration to transport large blocks of stone over long distances. Allegedly, there are even videos proving that Buddhist monks in the Himalayas can lift stones using only their mental will and chants. The US-American Wally Wallington says that these theories are all nonsense. The resourceful man demonstrated how large stones can be raised with simple techniques using leverage and counterweights. The experiment actually proves that the placement of the stones can just about be explained. However, even Wally had no answers to the question of how the stones were transported over hundreds of kilometers. Stonehenge, therefore, remains a place of fantasy and speculation, and the latest discovery proves that even science has by no means found out everything about this place. Stonehenge is not the only place. It is a fascinating fact that we find the shape of stone circles and megaliths all over the world. Generally, megaliths are interpreted as symbols of the connections between heaven and earth, and they are depicted as sacred places of ordinary people. However, they could also be something like an energetic network or point to a cultural connection that we have not yet understood. Nebra, in Saxony-Anhalt, is home to the oldest ring wall site on Earth, and archaeologists have found one of the oldest star charts nearby. In addition to the Sun and the Moon, the Nebra sky disk probably shows the Pleiades. Experts date this find to around 1600 BC. We are still in the Bronze Age here, but we have to wonder why such a rare and certainly very valuable artifact at the time shows 7 stars of all things, which are not actually so prominent in the night sky. In Spain, there is the Dolmen of Guadalupero, which lay underwater for a long time and only became visible during a period of drought. Known as the Stonehenge, this prehistoric stone circle is also said to have been a solar observatory. But why the effort? Located in the western part of the eponymous mountain range, the dolmens are probably one of the most confusing testimonies of the past. In fact, experts do not know who created these stone mysteries, nor what purpose they served at all. However, considering their unusual design and intriguing geometric details, many an alternative thinker believes that the mystery of the dolmens has finally been solved. After all, they are supposed to testify to nothing less than the fact that the inhabitants of the distant past were already in possession of advanced technologies. Some of the terms are almost too much for the average person to grasp. After all, what exactly is a dolmen? Well, if you just shrug your shoulders, we'll be happy to play the dolmen translator for you. By definition, we are dealing here with a structure made of large stone blocks, consisting of at least 3 upright supporting stones and covered by 1 or more stone slabs. So far, so stony. But what purpose did the structures serve, which, incidentally, we find not only in Europe, but also in northern Africa and in parts of Asia? In this regard, experts point out that we are dealing here with millennia-old burial structures. However, if we compare the individual examples with each other, we quickly realize that not all dolmens are the same. The dolmens of the Caucasus differ greatly from their counterparts in the rest of the world. Not only are they much more precisely crafted than other counterparts, but they are also not surrounded by mounds of earth and are closed at the front. And while the unusual dolmens in the west of the mighty mountain range, more precisely in the southern Russia, Georgia, and the Abkhazia region, cover an area of around 12,000 square kilometers, it is their round holes that really catch our eye. Most researchers assume that these so-called soul holes are openings that allow the souls of the dead to enter and leave the site. However, this is only an established but purely theoretical assumption. In fact, there are no archaeological finds that clearly prove that burials were actually carried out in the Caucasus dolmens. What we do have, however, are mortal remains that have come to light in the vicinity of the dolmens. But skeptics point out that we don't know whether these were buried there much later. But at least the ceramic fragments recovered in the area seem to provide us with at least some indication of the age of the stone buildings. Their analysis showed that they were made between 4,000 and 6,000 years ago. And if we now go back to the soul holes, we see that the afterlife portals are by no means always circular, but sometimes square, and that they were often provided with stone plugs to close the gate at the front. But even aside from that, the design of the Caucasus dolmens leaves us open-mouthed. For example, the massive blocks were provided with exact 90-degree angles in places so that they could be used as cornerstones. Elsewhere, the stones were bent to create a circle when connected. Added to this is the fact that the stones are arranged in an amazingly regular pattern, and that their surfaces have been perfectly smoothed. All in all, the Caucasus dolmens represent nothing less than a unique type of prehistoric architecture. Proof of a lost technology? In front of the dolmens, there is usually a courtyard, which, according to experts, was used to hold sacred rituals and ceremonies. And while this courtyard is usually surrounded by large stone walls, sometimes over a meter high, Bronze Age and Iron Age pottery, human remains, bronze tools, and precious gold and silver jewelry have been found in this area. And the fact that the dolmens were apparently very popular in the corresponding epochs is proven by the fact that 3,000 of these megalithic monuments have already been discovered in the Western Caucasus, and that the number of new discoveries is constantly growing. However, it is in the nature of things that the construction of the dolmens was, to put it mildly, quite challenging. After all, each of these structures weighs an average of 15 to 30 tons. This makes it all the more confusing that there is not the slightest trace of a quarry in the region. What's more, around the dolmens, scientists did not even find any evidence that the massive stones were somehow dragged to their intended location. And where there are no clear traces of transport, the way is open for theories of a somewhat different kind. Because in fact, the idea that the blocks, each weighing tons, were moved from A to B using only pure muscle power, and then also shaped into such amazing forms, seems, to put it mildly, questionable for alternative historians. Instead, according to the not entirely uncontroversial assumption, the Caucasus dolmens, with their smooth surfaces and circular holes, would testify that their creators were in possession of far more advanced technologies, and that was already the case 4,000 to 6,000 years ago. How you view this unorthodox interpretation is up to you, but the actual construction of the structures seems extraordinary. In most dolmens, the huge stone slabs are connected to each other by specifically crafted grooves, and often so precisely that you couldn't even slide a sheet of paper between the chunks. But how is that even possible? How did the people, thousands of years ago, with the simple means of their time, manage to create such complex stone structures? Well, a team of researchers wanted to find out exactly that in 2007, which is why they decided to reconstruct a copy of the destroyed structures in the Russian city of Gelendzhik. And although the experts were able to use the original ancient parts, they ultimately did not succeed in achieving the same precision as their prehistoric models. Who built the dolmens? But who were these prehistoric role models actually? In other words, which culture was already so advanced at the time that it could create these stone puzzles for posterity? Well, finding the answer to this question is anything but easy. In fact, archaeologist Vladimir Markovin, who has been studying the structures for years, points out that during the assumed period of their creation, people actually still lived in simple mud huts and didn't even know iron or the potter's wheel. And while they spent their days tilling the land with simple hoes, they were still able to erect structures that are extremely impressive by today's standards. However, we must not forget one thing at this point. The corresponding dating to the period between 4,000 and 6,000 years ago is only one of several approaches. Other experts consider it more likely that the artifacts recovered around the dolmens were only placed there much later, and therefore believe that the structures could even be up to 25,000 years old. However, the roots of the Klin Yar community and the Koban culture do not go back 25,000 years. And yet it is these two groups, once based in the Caucasus, that are often associated with the dolmens. However, since this is once again merely an unproven historical assumption, the imagination of alternative theories continues to know no bounds. Researchers with a penchant for the esoteric, who don't have much of an understanding of grave interpretation, believe, for example, that the stone structures mark special power places with strong energy fields. These ominous forces are even said to be able to cure serious illness and unleash our hidden abilities. And even today, pilgrims still travel to the Caucasus dolmens to make contact with unseen powers. Of course, the pre-astronautics community is also throwing its hat into the discussion ring. As is well known, the followers of this parascientific movement are firmly convinced that the inhabitants of ancient times were regularly visited by aliens. Worshipped as wondrous gods by our ancestors, the extraterrestrial guests helped people in return to build structures such as the pyramids, Stonehenge, or even the Caucasus dolmens. But there is another, no less surprising, but rather different explanation. Ask the locals about the history of the dolmens and you are likely to hear the story of the dwarves. These cute creatures are said to have once lived in the area. They were so tiny that they could even ride on hares, and they lived side by side with the giants who kindly built stone dwellings for their diminutive neighbors. But the dwarves had a way all their own of thanking their gigantic house builders. Since they had no desire to return the giants' help, they simply decided to blind them and force mind-altering herbs down their throats. The intoxicated giants then completely lost their minds and began to wipe out first the dwarves and then themselves. All that remained were the dwarf dwellings, which we know today as dolmens, and a fairy tale, if not entirely plausible, explanation for the existence of the mysterious stone structures. If you want to see the archaeological site of Tinawanku with your own eyes, you need a lot of stamina. After all, at 3,850 meters above sea level, the air can confidently be described as thin. Part of Pumapunku Tinawanku is located in the Alaplano Plateau near Lake Titicaca, and thus officially belongs to an artificially created platform hill. But a quick glance at its terraced layout, its equally ingenious and massive canals, and not least its imposing monumental structures, which have long since been destroyed, proves that this description does not really do justice to the genius behind the creation of the complex. And yet, it is not only the dizzying height, we are talking about one of the highest urban centers in the world, that makes Pumapunku so unique. No, because the architecture used here has no known precedent in the entire Andes. And while the corresponding stone blocks were so intricately crafted that they are a mystery even to modern stonemasons, we cannot even say with absolute certainty who created the site in the first place. In fact, the relevant specialist text reports on several different cultures that used Tinawanku as a religious and political center between 1500 BC and 1200 AD. In this regard, experts assume that the Tinawanku state existed for about 2,000 years. And during this time, as it developed southeast of Lake Titicaca, it probably reached an extent of over 500,000 square kilometers in its heyday and provided a home for around 500,000 people. And in view of these dimensions, it is practically obvious that the Tinawanku culture has not only immortalized its heritage in Pumapunku, in fact, this ancient people also managed to develop effective irrigation systems that covered an area of more than 80 square kilometers and ensured the stable cultivation of essential crops such as potatoes, corn, and quinoa. It seems that the Tinawanku culture suddenly disappeared around the year 1000 AD, and we don't know the definite answer to the question of what led to this abrupt demise. One theory is based on the assumption that the culture succumbed to a severe drought, and since its members were no longer able to maintain food crops as a result, the community fragmented and eventually sank completely into the shadows of the past. The mystery of the H blocks. A different century, the same mystery. While the architectural wonders of Tinawanku are still shrouded in many questions to this day, the Spanish conquistadors also wondered how the stone monuments could be hewn out of the ground at all. Specifically, the Spaniards in the 16th century simply could not explain how such massive stones could be transported and then shaped into such extraordinary forms. The fact that the situation is not much different in its basic features over 500 years later is again due to the fact that Tinawanku no longer has anything to do with its original appearance. And by that, we really mean nothing. Since Tinawanku is one of the most looted and destroyed sites in all of South America, none of the monolith blocks are still in their original place. In fact, the structures were only rebuilt afterwards, and some historians estimate that this has only further deepened the architectural mystery. There was simply no basis for the reconstruction, and it would have been a very big coincidence if the efforts of modern times had hit the exact core of antiquity. But even if we leave aside the correct arrangement of the structures for a moment, one thing is indisputable. Many components of Pumapunku and Tiahuanaco seem so mysterious that they immediately leave us with raised eyebrows. Take a closer look at the so-called H blocks. As the name suggests, they are shaped like the letter from which they take their name. However, they also have ridiculously straight edges and are sometimes exactly 1 meter high. In view of this, the alternative camp wonders whether these mysterious testimonies were really only made with primitive hand tools, or whether some kind of laser cutting technology was not used after all. By the way, pre-astronauticists like Eric von Daniken also think they know exactly who brought our ancestors the corresponding technologies, but more about that in a moment. In any case, it is clear that the H-shaped blocks of Pumapunku are no exception. No matter where we look, we are met with amazing stone carvings that testify to the extraordinary skills of their creators. And while the so-called arrow stones or the blocks with the typical Andean crosses also amaze us, we must not forget that some of the structures are gigantic. For example, the researchers at Pumapunku have already discovered a monolith that is over 7.8 meters long and weighs an incredible 130 tons. In this regard, the material analysis has shown that the Colossus was brought from a quarry 10 kilometers away. But how exactly did people accomplish this hundreds of years ago? Well, even the experts can only offer theories in this regard, but it is thought likely that a combination of ramps, ropes, and sheer muscle power was used. The work of aliens? Oh yes. But what about the image on the Tiwanaku Sun Gate, which clearly shows an alien and thus proves that the inhabitants of ancient times were regularly visited by extraterrestrial intelligences? Well, a dyed-in-the-wool pre-astronaut would probably react to these of conservative historians in one of these ways or another. As already briefly mentioned, the not entirely uncontroversial author and alternative researcher Eric von Daniken is firmly convinced that the Sun Gate does not show us a figure on a pedestal, as is commonly claimed, but an extraterrestrial being floating in a spaceship. But that's not all. The inscriptions on the gable of the structure also would leave no doubt that the creature once came to Earth on board a flying saucer. However, the other side emphasizes that this interpretation is absolutely far-fetched and lacks any serious basis. Despite all this, however, von Daniken's followers continue to believe that what is written in our history books has nothing to do with historical reality. After all, there is a reason why so many different cultures of the past had a cult of the gods that revolved around heavenly beings who revealed higher knowledge to the inhabitants of the earth. As you can probably already guess, these gods are said to have been extraterrestrial in the flesh. But since our ancestors were unable to explain the futuristic technologies of their visitors, they were simply given a supernatural background. This 3D model aims to put an end to alien speculation. But now we find ourselves in the comfortable situation of being able to examine the mysteries of days long gone in a completely different way. And so it came about that a group of scientists from the University of California in Los Angeles set out to create the first 3D model of Pumapunku, and in doing so, to verify whether the site is really as unusual and unique as is often said to be. Before they could do that, however, the researchers had to gather all the information about Pumapunku that had been collected over the last 150 years. With the help of notes, descriptions, images, and finds, the experts reconstructed almost everything that had been discovered about the site so far, and, according to them, provided clear evidence that the claims of the pre-astronauticians are false. After all, the final, true-to-scale 3D print shows that Pumapunku does not really break with tradition as dramatically as previously assumed. Quite the opposite. In their study, the researchers demonstrated that the design used here can even be found in 2 other nearby sites. But how could the researchers be so sure? Because just like Tiwanaku, Pumapunku was also devastated beyond repair in the course of the past, and as already mentioned, we don't actually know of any other example in the entire Andes region that we could use for orientation. Well, sometimes the solution to the puzzle is simply called intuition. After the experts had made the 150 individual parts of the site, their size, shape, and thickness practically showed by themselves how they had to be put together correctly. And where the tactile nature of the components met the intuitive inspiration of the experts, a kind of 3D puzzle was created that finally showed Pumapunku in its original form. Well, that's true for one side at least. Whether von Daniken and company would also let themselves be converted by this, to put it casually, scientific tinkering session is, of course, a completely different matter. Heavier. The monoliths enthroned in the quarry of Baalbek, located in present-day Lebanon, the massive colossi are considered to be the largest known stone blocks from ancient times. The Pregnant Woman's Stone and its 2 unnamed counterparts weigh around 1,000, 1,240, and 1,650 tons respectively. And the Romans are said to have planned to move the monoliths to the nearby temple district to incorporate them into the foundations of their shrines. However, exactly how the stones were to be transported remains a historical mystery. But perhaps it was their sheer size that ensured that the oversized blocks remained in place forever. A perfectly understandable explanation, but on closer inspection it raises even more questions. If the Romans failed to transport the stones of Baalbek in this case, how did they manage it another time? The Temple of Jupiter, mentioned at the beginning, is enthroned on the so-called Trilithon, and thus on a podium that contains 3 stone blocks, each weighing 800 tons. However, the Romans must not only have managed to somehow bring the stone giants to their intended location, but also to place them on a layer of blocks weighing 350 tons each. But were the Romans really the ones who created this awe-inspiring podium? Well, some alternative thinkers believe that the gigantic foundations of Baalbek were already completed when the Roman builders arrived there. By implication, they would have merely placed their magnificent buildings on the existing structure. But whether the Romans did it or not, someone must have created these monumental objects thousands of years ago and then integrated them into a larger structure. There is no question that lifting an 800-ton structure was a challenging task, to say the least, but there is also no question that 800 tons is nothing compared to 3,000 tons. The mystery of the Gornaya Sharia megaliths. The 3 blocks of the Trilithon weigh 2,400 tons in total. On the one hand, that is about as much as 16 blue whales. And on the other hand, it is still less than the estimated weight of the Gornaya Sharia megaliths. This is estimated at around 3,000 tons, and that is per single stone block. And just to be clear, we are not talking about a few loosely scattered blocks here, but rather about a kind of continuous wall that is over 200 meters long and consists of stones that are on average 20 meters long. Now, there are 2 ways to approach this impressive structure. In the region of mountain shrines, located in southern Siberia, the conservative researchers emphasize that we are dealing here with a purely natural structure, the creation of which requires neither the existence of a lost civilization nor the use of prehistoric high technology. More precisely, the megaliths form the ridges and summit of the 1,200-meter-high mountain Kulium, and they result from a combination of various geological processes and the intense weathering of the rock. On the other hand, however, there is the assumption that they are by no means just a rocky whim of nature, but clear evidence that our ancestors achieved technological milestones that we dare not even dream of today. And anyone who delves a little into the mystery of the Gornaya Sharia megaliths will sooner or later come across the name Georgy Sidorov. He discovered the structures in 2013 and was immediately deeply impressed by its dimensions and design. Sidorov emphasized that the structure is comparable to the splendor of the Egyptian pyramids. Furthermore, there are even circular drill holes and some traces of melting. But that's not all. When Sidorov and his companions inspected the site, their compasses also reportedly went haywire. In line with this, the researchers suspected a, quote, negative geomagnetic field that suggests advanced ancient knowledge. Those who actually believe that the Gornaya Sharia megaliths are a man-made structure therefore consider it possible, on this basis, that their creators harnessed forces that far exceed our modern understanding. Apart from that, the situation also raises more questions than it answers. After all, why on earth would someone build a monumental structure in such a harsh environment? And what purpose did the structure serve in the first place? The work of a lost civilization? The task of heaving countless stone blocks weighing thousands of tons on top of a remote mountain would probably push even our modern construction equipment to its limits. And with the knowledge that the age of the Gornaya Sharia megaliths is estimated to be at least 10,000 years old, a simple yet profound question arises. How could this have been possible at all? Well, to understand this, we have to delve a little deeper into the highly controversial field of fringe science. And bear in mind that many alternative researchers believe in the existence of a highly developed but completely forgotten advanced civilization that was wiped out at the end of the last ice age by a severe flood disaster. Afterwards, however, the few survivors of the apocalypse succeeded in going out to the rest of the world and bringing the simpler peoples the gift of civilization. This is also the reason why so many different cultures tell the story of an all-destroying flood. from which higher beings emerged, and why we find gigantic stone structures like the pyramids or the Gornaya Sharia megaliths in all corners of the world. But it gets even more controversial. Where the skills of our ancestors end, some people think it more likely that the colossal structure was actually created by actual giants or aliens. We probably don't need to emphasize at this point that such theories are not really welcomed with open arms in the rest of the research world. But what about the question of the suspected purpose? Well, assuming that we are really dealing with an artificial formation here, it could be a site that once became the focus of religious or ceremonial rituals. Alternatively, the formation could have served as a site for astronomical observations. But the list of speculations does not end there. Some people even associate the megaliths with the abdominal snowman, which is said to have been sighted several times in the region. But before we get too lost in the world of mythical creatures, we should stick to the established facts. And these say that a previously completely unknown relative of man was discovered near the stone giant. The legacy of the Denisova man? A small bone, a big sensation. After experts analyzed the DNA from the mitochondria of a tiny finger bone in 2010, there was no longer any doubt that the Homo genus had a new population. The groundbreaking fossil was discovered in a cave in the Altai Mountains in southern Siberia. Later, the lower jaw of the Denisova human was also found in Tibet. And while the latter dates back 160,000 years, the bones recovered in the Siberian cave are between 76,000 and 52,000 years old. That being said, our knowledge of Denisova humans is, to put it mildly, limited. And you can probably already guess where the alternative journey goes from here. Because although there is no evidence for it, some people believe that the megaliths were created neither by nature nor by our species, but by the Denisova humans. After all, the remains of threads and beads have already been found in Denisova Cave in 2021, which would clearly show that the Denisova people were significantly more advanced than previously thought. However, there is a small but subtle difference between making a string of beads and creating a monument made of stones weighing 3,000 tons. Three ancient record holders meet. What may sound like the beginning of a joke at first is actually a remarkable fact, because the gigantic stone blocks enthroned in the quarry at Baalbek in present-day Lebanon are among the largest known monoliths in the world. No less remarkable is the fact that the third monolith was only discovered in 2014, and who knows what other stone giants the excavations will bring to light in the future. Well, so far no one. But looking back, the history of research into the Stone of the Pregnant Woman is all the more older. After all, it was already mentioned in the early 16th century by the knight Martin Baumgartner. Accordingly, we have known for quite some time that the oversized limestone block is a good 20 meters long, over 5 meters wide in places, and more than 4 meters high. Taking into account its density, the experts ultimately concluded that the monolith weighs a good 1,000 tons, which is still a few hundred kilos less than its even more massive counterparts. Accordingly, the weight of the monoliths that were brought to light in the 90s and 2014, and which, in contrast to the Pregnant Woman's Stone, did not receive an official name, is even estimated at 1,240 and 1,650 tons, respectively. But what was the point of them anyway? Who went to the trouble of hewing these almost laughably large structures out of the ground, and what purpose did they serve? As mentioned at the beginning, the Romans are considered to be the creators of the mega monoliths. No wonder, since the corresponding quarry is only 900 meters away from the temple complexes of Baalbek, which were built between the 1st and 3rd centuries AD and are considered a prime example of Roman monumental architecture. In light of this, most historians assume that the three monoliths were also to be brought to the sacred temple district to form the foundation of another colossal building. But while a distance of 900 meters doesn't really sound like an insurmountable distance at first, this changes abruptly when you have over 1,000 tons in your luggage. So how did the Romans plan to move their gigantic loads from A to B? Well, we simply don't know. Since we have no historical records in this regard, the experts have no choice but to delve into the realm of speculation and theories. However, this would require a sound theory. But so far, there simply isn't one. In fact, the relevant specialist texts merely state that the reasons for the planned stone transport are unclear. However, it seems that the often invoked idea of wooden rollers or sleds reaches its limit in this case. After all, they would have immediately sunk into the sandy ground or broken under the immense weight of the monoliths. In the same breath, however, the experts emphasized that it was possible in the past to move enormous objects over long distances despite this, and, it should be noted, without the use of lost advanced technologies. In particular, the researchers referred to the obelisk in St. Peter's Square, which was moved to its new location in 1586 with the help of 900 workers, 150 horses, and 47 winches. And yet, it is worth noting that the rose granite monolith weighs only 320 tons, over 1,300 tons less than the heaviest of the Baalbek monoliths. Well, but maybe that's exactly why the 3 extra large chunks never made it out of the quarry. Because in the end, the Romans may have had to admit to themselves that they had overestimated themselves with their architectural megalomania and left unfinished. This is a perfectly understandable explanation, but it has a small but crucial catch. If we now take our eyes off the quarry and turn them to the actual temple complex, we see that the Romans did manage to transport monoliths of this size and fit them into their monumental buildings. The enigmatic blocks of the Temple of Jupiter. Great God, great temple. After all, there was no other deity in the Roman religion that stood above Jupiter. It is therefore not particularly surprising that this special divine position is also reflected in the Jupiter sanctuary at Baalbek. And in the end, there stood a temple here that was almost 290 meters long, 20 meters high, and had 54 columns, which probably made every observer freeze in awe. And although the Temple of Jupiter was one of the largest complexes in the entire Roman Empire, this was probably not only due to the astonishing dimensions of the complex, but also to its gigantic podium, which still fuels the wildest speculation to this day. This consists of the so-called trilithon, and thus of 3 blocks that are considered to be the largest stones ever used in the world. Just imagine, experts estimate that each of these colossal blocks weighs around 800 tons. But that's not all. The trilithon is by no means the bottom layer of the podium. Instead, it sits on a layer of additional stone blocks, each of which weighs 350 tons. In other words, the Romans in the 1st century AD must somehow have managed to shape the 800-ton blocks in the quarry several hundred meters away, then bring them to the temple district, and then maneuver them into place to set them on the underlying layer. And if we look even more closely, we see that the stones of the trilithon were by no means placed next to each other any old how, but fit together so perfectly that not even a sheet of paper would fit between them. But how is that even possible? In the photos of the platform and the quarry monoliths, the adults standing in front of them look like puny dwarves. So could it be that the Romans had some kind of lost advanced technology that enabled them to complete these architectural wonders? Well, surprisingly, even the alternative minds answer this question with a definite no. Not because they point to a combination of pulleys, ropes, and sheer muscle power, instead, but to the theory that it was not the Romans at all who created and moved the mega monoliths. The work of a lost civilization? According to one ancient legend, a certain Romulus began the construction of the Temple of Jupiter to thank the gods for a great victory on the battlefield. However, according to another legend, the legendary co-founder of Rome had nothing to do with the creation of the original complex, for the simple reason that it had long since come into existence by the time the Romans arrived in Baalbek. In other words, the Romans simply used the pre-existing podium to build their own shrines on top of it. A, well, admittedly bold guess, but what arguments do the alternative historians have to offer? Well, for one thing, there is simply no contemporary source that reports when and how exactly the Temple of Jupiter was built, or who commissioned its construction. The fact that we are dealing with the work of the Romans is therefore nothing more than an established assumption and not a proven fact. Furthermore, the complex features a wide range of construction methods. While countless smaller blocks were used in some places, much larger stones catch the eye in others. A uniform pattern would look different, and in this respect, some components with their unusual appearance would even seem to suggest that they originally belonged to a completely different structure. And then there is also the location problem. Baalbek is located over 2,200 kilometers from Rome. So why would the Romans have decided to build their largest stone wonders so far from the heart of their empire? In fact, the heaviest monolith we find there is the Trajan's Column, which was erected in honor of the Roman Emperor Trajan and weighs just 53 tons. In other words, the trilithic blocks are 15 times heavier than the imperial honorary monument. And if we take a closer look at other magnificent Roman buildings, such as the Colosseum, we quickly realize that the Romans used a combination of countless small blocks for these structures, and not full-grown giants, each weighing as much as 7 to 8 blue whales. Moreover, even in the conservative world of research, there is no question that the Romans were by no means the first to leave their mark in Baalbek. Archaeological investigations have shown that the human settlement history of the region goes back at least 11,000 years and did not begin in the 1st century AD. For a hypothetical precursor civilization, this would have been more than enough time to literally lay the foundation for the later Roman buildings. It is undisputed that the colossi of Baalbek are still accompanied by some question marks, and yet we should not forget that the same would apply to the case of an unknown creator culture. Because here too, we would neither know how the people of the distant past managed to create the giant monoliths, nor how they subsequently transported and placed them. So what remains to be said in conclusion? Well, one thing is certain: the discussions about the true background of the ancient monumental buildings will not stop anytime soon. But it is also clear that the giant structures remind us once again how much there is yet to learn about the lives of our ancestors in the future, and that they open up a fascinating, vivid window on days long gone. And speaking of windows, are there any fans of Hidden Worlds out here? If you shouted yes out loud, you are very welcome to click on the thumb and the subscribe button so you never miss a new video from us again. See you soon!